Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at witch hunts in Scandinavia and especially the Great Rumble, the largest witch hunt in Northern Europe, to date at least. It occurred during the reign of King Karl XI of Sweden, just as he was busy trying to fight off the Danes who tried to regain Scania. Today, we'll see what conclusions Karl XI drew based on that Scania War and what plans he had for the future of Sweden. Episode 101, Empire. The Danish invasion in 1675 could have ended in the recapture of Scania, Halland and Blekinge, and the conquest of who knows what else. Even though Sweden had managed to hold on to all the territory gained during Karl X Gustav's wars, it was mostly thanks to French pressure on the Danes. Karl XI realized this, and he was determined to make sure that his kingdom wouldn't be dependent on the favor of the great powers of Europe in order to protect itself in the future. To make sure that would be the case, he launched a number of important economic, military, and political reforms that were aimed at strengthening Sweden. Reforms that would ensure that the kingdom would be able to punch above its weight in the years to come. The Riksdag, called in 1680, became a watershed in Swedish history, where the king geared up to take on not only the old regency government, but the high nobility as a whole. His aim was to break the power of the aristocracy and to strengthen the crown, just like his father-in-law had done in Denmark 20 years earlier. He shrewdly used the other three estates against the nobility in order to get what he wanted. And what Karl XI wanted was three important reforms, which would change Swedish society forever. First of all, he needed to increase the incomes of the crown. I've already hinted at it, but the regency government that had governed in his name when he was a child hadn't done a stellar job, to put it mildly. They had been too focused on enriching themselves and their noble friends and family instead of caring for the country. The consequences of this lack of care had been painfully clear during the Danish invasion in 1675, when the Swedes initially had only been able to watch the Danes pour across the Øresund Strait because the people in charge had neglected to secure a proper defense of the newly acquired province. Already when Karl XI reached his majority and personally took over the reins of state, he decided on a way to both increase the income of the crown and to undermine the nobility that had proved unworthy of his trust. He decided to confiscate land that previous monarchs had granted various noblemen as gifts, rewards, and bribes. It took a few years to get the project off the ground, but at the momentous Riksdag held in 1680, the king asked the estates to agree to a vast project of reclaiming former crown lands that had been granted to various aristocrats. The priests, burghers, and peasants were all in favor of the reform. That's not particularly surprising, since they didn't risk losing anything, but even a number of noblemen supported the request. These were poorer aristocrats from the lower rungs of the nobility, whose land wasn't in danger of being confiscated, because the king promised that there would be no more royal land confiscations in the future, and he only asked to have back lands with an annual income of over 600 thaler. For reference, approximately half of all the donated estates and lands had an income of less than 200 thaler. In addition to the confiscation of all land making more than 600 thaler in Sweden, the king's request also covered almost all lands in Sweden's overseas possessions, mostly in the German and Baltic provinces. Since only the richest families of the highest nobility stood to lose from this demand, the estates granted it. As a result, land with the estimated value of more than 200,000 thaler silver in annual income reverted to the crown. That was a considerable boost to the royal finances, but Karl XI soon realized that it wasn't enough. Already 2 years later, at the Riksdag in 1682, he returned to the estates with a request for another round of confiscations, despite his previous promise that it had been a one-time thing. Isn't it funny how this sort of demand almost never turns out to be a one-time thing? Anyway, the reason given for the new round of confiscations was that the army needed the funds. So in response, the nobility offered to make a voluntary contribution instead. But the three other estates weren't having any of it. They preferred to see the aristocrats sweat, and went as far as to give the king the right to take back whatever land he wanted, without even having to ask the Riksdag to approve it in the future. Karl XI made sure to use this new power to maximum effect in the coming years. It's difficult to say exactly how much money these confiscations brought to the king's coffers, but a reasonable estimate lands at just under $2 million silver in annual income. That's not counting the value of the land itself. Roughly $700,000 came from Sweden proper, including Finland, and the rest came from the overseas provinces. The Baltic province of Livonia alone brought in $550,000. This reform strengthened the crown both financially and politically at the expense of the nobility. It also strengthened the crown in an unexpected way. The planning and implementation of it all was a huge undertaking, and that in itself strengthened the centralization of Sweden, since the administration was beefed up and got a firmer grip over the country in the process. The reform also strengthened farmers who owned their own land as a class, not least because a considerable amount of the reclaimed crown land was then sold to peasants in the coming decades, increasing the number of independent farmers and therefore strengthening their voice in the local communities and in the Riksdag. In Livonia, this created something of a social revolution. Ever since the time of the Teutonic Order, the Livonian land had been owned by various noble families and worked by serfs. Now, the King of Sweden confiscated much of this land, in violation of local laws and customs, by the way, and turned the Livonian serfs into something new, a class of free farmers paying taxes to the crown. All of this was quite shocking in the eyes of many Baltic aristocrats who weren't used to peasants owning land and having rights. The confiscation also shook the nobility at home. The basis for their power, their economic strength, was now greatly reduced. In previous years, the landed aristocracy had enjoyed a certain level of independence vis-à-vis the king. Basically, they'd been so rich that they could do whatever they liked. Not so anymore. To make matters even worse, Karl XI did what so many other monarchs had done before him, not least in Denmark, when they wanted to expand their power. He relied on the lower or landless nobility to staff his administration. These nobles were completely dependent on the king for their position and could be expected to be loyal to him in order to protect themselves. This move marginalized the highest nobility even further. But you shouldn't feel too bad for the aristocrats of the late 1600s. They still didn't have to pay the taxes commoners were subject to, and all positions in the royal bureaucracy and the senior officer corps were still reserved for noblemen. So it wasn't like they were reduced to begging or anything. In parallel with his efforts to secure the Swedish finances, Karl XI also looked at other reforms he felt were needed to protect and strengthen his empire, maybe even expand it. One of his many concerns was the army. The Scania War had made it painfully clear that the Swedish army wasn't up to the job it was expected to do. The way soldiers were recruited was inefficient, and it created serious problems for the people whose sons, husbands, and farmhands were called up. It meant that this person's work at the farm had to be taken care of by someone else temporarily, if you were lucky. In the worst-case scenario, it would be permanent. In addition, there was usually no time to train these raw recruits properly, which not only meant that they were often rubbish at fighting wars, but they weren't used to life in the army, which led to a whole host of other social and health problems. Too many of the soldiers died before they could even be of any use. Hiring mercenaries wasn't an option. It was way too expensive, and even though they were usually competent enough as soldiers, hired swords could never be fully trusted. They were only loyal as long as the money kept coming and the times were good. The solution was to completely reorganize the way the Swedish army raised troops and to apply the so-called allotment system. In the past, it had been used for some officers and civilians such as priests and bell ringers, but now it was expanded to cover a big part of the army. The basic idea was that 2 or more farms would form a unit, and they would then recruit and fund a soldier. The farmers were obligated to provide the soldiers with a house, a plot of land, and a modest salary. In exchange, they and the people at their farms were exempted from military service. Almost all households had to be part of the allotment system and provide for a soldier. There were a few exceptions though, such as priests, officers, and innkeepers. To begin with, peasants living on land belonging to noblemen were also excluded, but from the 1690s onwards, they too had to participate. It proved relatively easy to recruit soldiers this way. It was a tempting career path, especially for younger sons whose oldest brother stood to inherit the family farm. These younger sons usually had no other choice but to become farmhands at other people's farms. But now they could become soldiers instead, with a house of their own and a plot of land big enough to provide for a wife and children. If, however, the farmers failed to fill a vacancy within 3 months, one of them would have to take the soldier's place. The reform was rolled out in the 1680s, and the crown could use some of the land it had confiscated from the nobility to provide farmland for these soldiers. Each province was tasked with providing a regiment of 1,200 men. The fact that all the soldiers in the regiment came from the same province meant they knew and trusted each other. It was good for morale, also because no soldiers wanted to seem cowardly or incompetent in front of their comrades from home. Rumors about that sort of thing would almost certainly be brought back to his home village by other returning soldiers. By the end of the 17th century, the allotment system had been implemented throughout the kingdom. At that time, the system provided some 25,000 foot soldiers, 11,000 cavalrymen, and 6,000 sailors to the armed forces. But there were also other military units, and all in all, Sweden could mobilize 76,000 men, which was twice as many as any other country in Europe in relation to the size of its population. These men would soon be put to good use, or at least to use. The third important reform that Karl XI pushed through at the eventful Riksdag in 1680 was purely political. He strengthened his own power, introducing absolutism also in Sweden, just like his father-in-law Frederick III had done in Denmark. Just like in the case of the confiscation of land, the king played out the 3 other estates against the nobility. The aristocrats tried to fight it, but they didn't stand a chance. The king had planned this meticulously, and it played out as something of a piece of political theatre. It started with Karl XI asking the estates the somewhat leading question if he had to follow the instrument of government from 1634 and whether he was obligated to rule based on the Council of the Realm. Once again, the nobles were run over by the 3 other estates, who responded that the king wasn't bound by the 1634 instrument of government, only by the laws of the land. Regarding the second question, they claimed the king's obligation was only to keep the council informed about what he was up to. The king, the estates concluded, wasn't answerable to the council, only to God. The king couldn't have been more pleased with the answer, and wasted no time to display his newfound authority. As a consequence of the support he'd received from the Riksdag, the king sent a message to the members of the council, letting them know that from now on they wouldn't be known as councillors of the realm, but rather councillors of the king, signaling that they were no longer members of an independent body that governed the kingdom, but merely advisors to the monarch. The members of the council hardly had time to recover from that slap in the face before the king let them know that he expected them all to hand in their letters of resignation. When they did, Karl XI accepted 8 of their resignations, letting only 7 stay on as members of the council. So not only was the council reduced in power and status, it was also purged of any members that the king suspected of not being loyal to him. This wasn't just a humiliation for the Council of the Realm, it meant the loss of power of the high nobility, which had governed the kingdom through the council for generations. In combination with the confiscation of land belonging to the aristocracy, this meant the introduction of royal absolutism, in practice if not in name. And even that last detail was taken care of in 1693, when the Riksdag convened and clarified that the king was to rule the kingdom alone, as he saw fit. It must have pleased Karl XI to attain the same kind of power as his brother-in-law, the King of Denmark, had. Unfortunately for Karl, he wouldn't get to enjoy his newly attained power for very long. Already by the late 1680s, it was clear that the king was ill. He would sometimes vomit blood, which is rarely a good sign. Now and then, he would also be stricken by fevers that forced him to stay in bed for days. Things only got worse after his wife, Ulrika Eleonora, passed away in 1693 at the age of only 36. Even though he hadn't been particularly impressed by her looks at first, the king had grown to love his Danish-born wife very much, and in the year following her death, he'd regularly start complaining about stomach pains. The doctors were powerless to stop the illness, and by February 1697, the pains were so severe that the king had to retire to the castle in Stockholm to rest. He never recovered, and on April 5th, 1697, he drew his last breath. He was only 41 years old. Before he died, he told his mother that he hadn't been happy for a single day ever since his wife died, and this soon morphed into a rumor that he died of a broken heart. In reality, though, it was abdominal cancer that finished him off. For the royal family, it was a tragedy that the king had died so young, not least for his son and heir, Karl, who was only 14 years old at the time, and who had to take over the top job years, if not decades, earlier than he possibly could have expected. But for the kingdom, it was a potential disaster. Karl XI had just finished his important reform agenda, and his firm and experienced hand was expected to lead for many years. What would happen now? Sweden was once again facing a situation with a child on the throne, and this time around, that child held absolute power. The death of the king wasn't the only crisis that hit Sweden that year. Crop failure and bad harvest had led to widespread hunger. Thousands of people died. And that wasn't the end of it. In the afternoon of May 7th, 1697, the fire warden's wife at the royal castle called Three Crowns in Stockholm thought she smelled smoke. She sent a guard to investigate, and he could soon report that the attic above the Hall of State was in full blaze. The fire spread rapidly throughout the 400-year-old building, where the copper roof conducted the heat, setting fire to the dry beams below. Servants soon had to abandon the attempts to put out the fire and instead focused on saving as much of the inventory as possible. Meanwhile, the royal family, including the child king Karl XII and his elderly grandmother Hedvig Eleonora, were escorted out. The old king, Karl XI, was still lying in state on the premises, but a group of soldiers managed to carry off the body and deposited it in a nearby church. After a few hours, when the fire had been raging unchecked, the awful crescendo came when the high central tower, sporting the 3 gilded crowns that had given the old castle its name, collapsed in a cloud of smoke and sparks. The cloud rose high above the city, then drifted across the water and descended upon a poorer neighborhood with tightly packed wooden houses. The sparks from the cloud soon started fires in these houses as well, so the royals were far from the only family that lost their homes that day. Even though servants and members of the court had been busy trying to save paintings, furniture, and other valuables from the burning building, far from everything could be saved. Of the 24,500 books and some 1,400 manuscripts in the Royal Library, only 6,000 books and 300 manuscripts were saved. In addition, much of the documents, letters, and other papers in the Royal Archive went up in flames. As a consequence, much of Sweden's medieval history is still cloaked in mystery. Almost all documentation from before 1697 was destroyed in the blaze. To the chagrin of many a Swedish nobleman, one of the few collections of documents that did survive was all the paperwork concerning the confiscation of land granted to the aristocracy. So that work could continue more or less undisturbed despite the catastrophic fire. So the reign of Karl XII didn't get off to the best of starts. But at least he was king of a hefty chunk of Europe. In 1697, Karl XII became king not only of Sweden and Finland, but also various bits of northern Germany, such as Pomerania, Bremen-Verden, Stralsund, and Wismar. In the Baltics, all the shores of the Gulf of Finland were in Swedish hands. That included the current location of the city of St. Petersburg, which still hadn't been founded. Estonia and Livonia, roughly today's Latvia, were also Swedish provinces. Of course, a 14-year-old couldn't be trusted to run an empire of that size, so a new regency government was formed. The government was headed by his elderly grandmother, Hedvig Eleonora, and she was aided by 5 royal councillors. One of them was Bengt Oxenstierna, whose father had been cousins to the more famous Axel. Not that the regency government did such an amazing job. They were blocked from working effectively because they disagreed on the question of which path Sweden should take in international politics. One faction wanted to stick to Sweden's traditional ally from the 1600s, that is France. Their opponents wanted Sweden to switch to the other European power bloc, led by Austria, England and the Netherlands. To make matters worse, they remembered all too well what had happened to the members of the regency that had governed in the name of Karl XI a generation before. They had all paid for the king's displeasure once he came into power. To avoid sharing their fate, the members of this new regency government constantly tried to curry favor with the young boy king, making sure he'd like them and not turn on them once he'd get the power to do so. In the end, one of the few things they could agree on was bringing the young king into the decision-making process as soon as possible. That would both break the deadlock and protect them from criticism later, since they'd let the king make the decisions. So already at the Riksdag that convened when Karl XI was finally buried, the nobility suggested that the now 15-year-old king be declared an adult. The motion was accepted, and the regency government was dissolved already after a few months, in November 1697. The only member of the Riksdag who objected was a man called Jacob Boetius, representing the priestly estate. But he objected to the system of absolute monarchy as a whole, not against giving this particular teenager absolute power. One of the first things Karl XII did after taking the reins was to have Jacob Boetius arrested and tried. He was sentenced to life in prison for his temerity to criticize the system of government in public. I guess you could say that the fate of the hapless priest rather proved his point. But the question is, at the end of the day, if he thought it had been worth making it. Already on December 14th that same year, Karl XII was crowned king in Stockholm. At the ceremony, his position as absolute monarch was highlighted by the fact that he didn't have to swear any oath of office that would limit his powers, and at the peak of the ceremony, he, and not the archbishop, put the crown on his own head. But as he was leaving the church, the crown slipped from his head and rolled away, sending courtiers scurrying to fetch the symbolic headgear. This incident was added to the untimely death of his father, the failed crops, and the fire at the castle, as yet another ill omen of bad things to come. So it's not exactly an exaggeration to state that Karl XII acceded to the throne at a challenging point in time. The young king also suffered from low self-esteem and was afraid to come across as clueless due to his inexperience and lack of education. So whenever he had to meet with foreign dignitaries, which was quite often since he ruled one of the largest kingdoms in Europe, he preferred to keep quiet and did what he could to keep all conversations as brief as possible. This strategy was only partially successful. The French ambassador saw through his reasons for climbing up, but that didn't mean he dismissed Karl XII. On the contrary, in a report that he sent back to Paris, he described him as a man of strong will and tenacity. But at the same time, he was worried that these characteristics might become dangerous both to the king himself and to his kingdom. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what the French call foreshadowing. Just like his father, Karl XII preferred to surround himself with members of the lower nobility, keeping the grandest and most powerful families at arm's length. These relatively modest advisors couldn't object effectively when Karl XII displayed an increasing tendency to ignore his advisors, making his own decisions without consulting anyone or explaining why he did what he did. One of the pieces of advice that the young king ignored was the suggestion that he should marry as soon as possible. Courtiers pushed for him to marry the Danish princess and his first cousin, Sophia Hedvig, but Karl XII brushed all such suggestions aside, saying he'd marry at a later stage in life. Considering the fact that there weren't all that many male members of the royal family around, this worried the advisors and counselors, but the king wasn't prepared to listen to their nagging. In general, Karl XII led a quiet, simple and disciplined life also after becoming king. But there was one curious exception in the year after his accession to the throne. In the summer of 1698, his cousin, Duke Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp, came to Stockholm to marry the king's sister, Princess Hedvig Sophia. Yeah, you're right, she had almost the same name as the Danish cousin who Karl had declined to marry. Anyway, Duke Frederick was 11 years older than the King of Sweden, but he was far from a mature father figure. On the contrary, he convinced his royal cousin to participate in a series of drunken escapades that raised eyebrows among both courtiers and burghers in Stockholm. In a mere 6 months, Karl XII spent $1 million on parties, balls and theatre productions. Both Swedish dignitaries and foreign diplomats drew the conclusion that this kind of reckless spending was the result of an immature teenager getting too much power at too young an age. If the heavy drinking and the wasting of money weren't bad enough for the king's reputation, he and Frederick would ride through the streets of the capital, knocking hats and pulling wigs off random people. Like 1980s rock stars, they would also throw furniture out the window of the palace, among other pranks that tried the patience of everyone around them. Some of these stories, like the ones about them bringing goats, sheep and dogs into the palace, cutting their heads off and then lobbing them out through the window, are probably exaggerated or completely made up. But there were enough real shenanigans going on that the displeasure with their behavior spread in wide circles. One Sunday that summer, 3 priests in Stockholm got together and based their sermons on the Bible verse from Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 16, which goes, "Woe to thee, O land, when thy king is a child." Not the most subtle of hints. The episode known as the Gottorp Fury ended when Duke Frederick and his new wife left Stockholm in August. The king sobered up and returned to deal with affairs of state. But when Frederick returned for another visit in 1699, the king fell off the wagon again, and the wild partying resumed, arguably worse than ever before. During a drunken celebration at the palace, the duke and the king thought it would be hilarious to give wine to a tame bear. The animal drank far too much, became drunk, and fell to his death from a window. After that, the king's grandmother, the widow of Karl X Gustav, put her foot down. She, who was one of the very few people who could do so, gave the young absolute monarch a real dressing down. It worked. The chastened king swore never to drink another drop of alcohol in his life, and he actually stuck to that promise, with one famous exception, which we'll get back to in a future episode. Anyway, the teenage king had sobered up just in time. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Storm clouds in the form of the kingdom's enemies, getting together to plan a way to exploit the fact that Sweden was now governed by a reckless child with absolute power who could be goaded into abandoning his duties to go on a drunken rampage for 6 months. These enemies, Denmark, Poland, and Russia, had spent decades watching the Swedish Empire expand at their expense, but now it seemed that the time was ripe to fight back. In the year 1700, they declared war. Karl XII was faced with a simultaneous military conflict against a coalition of 3 hostile neighbors. Soon, additional principalities, such as Saxony and Hanover, would join the anti-Swedish alliance. This was the worst-case scenario, as far as the Swedes were concerned. It's true that their new army was well-trained and quick to mobilize, not to mention cheap, and it would stand a good chance to fight off any of these enemies one at a time, but not all at once. It seemed like the days of the Swedish Empire were numbered. Check in again next time to see what happened. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word among your friends who are also into 17th century reform policy? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.